The morning Evangeline Cobb rode into Duster's Creek, she wasn't looking for trouble. She was looking for a hired hand. What she found instead was a man locked in an iron cage in the middle of the town square, with a price tag nailed to the post above his head and a crowd of men laughing at him like he was something less than human. She almost rode past. Almost. Evangeline was 26 years old, unmarried by choice, and the sole owner of the Cobb family ranch, 300 acres of dry Texas land that her father had left her when he died the previous winter. The land was good, the cattle were healthy, but the ranch hands had quit, one by one, after word spread that a woman was running things alone. Nobody in Duster's Creek said it plainly, but the message was clear enough. A woman without a man wasn't taken seriously, and a ranch without men wasn't going to last the season. She needed help. She needed it badly, but nothing in her life had prepared her for what she saw in that cage. The man inside it was tall. Even sitting on the cage floor with his knees pulled up, that much was obvious. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. His dark hair was matted with dust. There was a cut above his left brow, dried and old, not fresh. He wasn't crying. He wasn't begging. He sat completely still, eyes forward, jaw set, staring at a point somewhere past the crowd as if none of them existed. That stillness was what stopped Evangeline. Most men in that position would have been shouting, bargaining, breaking down. This one looked like he was simply waiting, with the patience of someone who had learned, a long time ago, that panic solved nothing. A hand-painted sign above the cage read, "Labor Auction. Unclaimed prisoner, strong back, fair price." She pulled her horse to a stop and looked at the man running the auction, a wiry fellow named Hatch, who operated out of the back of a supply wagon and smelled like old tobacco. "What's his story?" Evangeline asked. Hatch squinted up at her. "Drifter, caught outside of Morrow County 3 weeks back. No family, no papers. No one's claimed him. Judge says he works off a debt or sits in that cage till fall." "What debt?" Quote, "Destruction of property. Or so they say." Hatch said it with a shrug that suggested he didn't much care either way. Evangeline looked back at the man in the cage. He still hadn't moved, but something had shifted. She noticed it only because she was watching closely. His eyes had dropped, just slightly, in her direction, then back up. It lasted less than a second. He was listening, carefully. She told herself she was being practical. The ranch needed a strong back. The price was low. It was a simple transaction, nothing more. She didn't let herself think too hard about the cage, or the sign, or the way the men in the crowd had laughed when she approached. Laughed at her, not him, because a woman making a bid was apparently the funniest thing Duster's Creek had seen all month. She made the bid anyway. No one else raised a hand. Whether that was because the price was already fair, or because no one wanted to be outbid by a woman, she couldn't say. Either way, the gavel came down, and Hatch handed her a folded paper that listed the terms of labor. 6 months, room and board, no wages beyond the debt settlement. The cage door opened with a groan of old iron. The man stood up slowly, unfolding himself to his full height. He was taller than she'd estimated. He rolled his shoulder once, quietly, like someone checking that the parts still worked, and then he looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were gray, steady, unreadable. "I'm Evangeline Cobb," she said. "I run the Cobb Ranch 12 miles north. You'll work the land, tend the cattle, and keep to yourself. In 6 months, you're free to go wherever you like." He was quiet for a moment, not a rude quiet, a careful one. "Samuel," he said, just the one word. No last name offered. She noticed that. She didn't remark on it. "Can you ride?" Quote, "Yes." "Can you work cattle?" Quote, a pause, "Yes." "Then let's go." Quote. The ride back to the ranch was long and mostly silent. Samuel rode the spare horse she had brought, more out of habit than expectation, she would later think, and he sat in the saddle like a man who had spent years on horseback. Easy, natural, like the horse already trusted him. Evangeline kept her eyes on the road. She wasn't a woman given to nervousness, but she was honest enough with herself to admit that she didn't fully know what she'd done back there. She had bought a man's labor, yes. That was the legal truth of it. But there were layers to it that she hadn't fully thought through, and the closer they got to the ranch, the more those layers pressed on her. She knew nothing about him. Only a name, and she wasn't even sure that was real. The ranch house came into view just before noon. It was a solid structure, nothing fancy, built from timber and stone by her father's hands 30 years ago. A barn stood to the east. A small bunkhouse sat behind it, empty now, swept clean. "You'll sleep in the bunkhouse," Evangeline said. "There's a basin inside. Supper's at sundown. I cook once. If you miss it, you find your own." Samuel looked at the bunkhouse, then at the barn, then at the cattle grazing in the far field. She watched his eyes move across them, slow and deliberate, like a man taking inventory. "How many head?" he asked. 83. He nodded once, as if that number meant something specific to him, as if he was calculating something she wasn't part of. That was the second time she noticed he knew more than he was saying. She just didn't know yet how much more. That first evening after supper, Evangeline sat on the porch with her father's ledger open across her knees. The numbers were bad. Not desperate, not yet, but trending in a direction that kept her awake most nights. She needed the season to go well. She needed everything to go exactly right. From inside the barn, she could hear Samuel moving. Slow, deliberate sounds. Checking the stalls, she realized, making sure the animals were settled for the night. She hadn't asked him to do that. It was the kind of thing an experienced rancher did without being told. She looked down at the ledger, then back at the barn. "Who are you, Samuel?" The question sat in her chest like an ember, small, quiet, and refusing to go out. She told herself it didn't matter. He was a hired hand. 6 months, and he'd be gone. But that night, just before she blew out the lamp, she thought about the way he had looked at those cattle, like a man who recognized something familiar. And she wondered, for the first time, what exactly she had brought home. The first week passed quietly. Samuel worked without being directed. He was up before Evangeline each morning. She knew this because by the time she stepped onto the porch with her coffee, the barn was already open, the horses fed, and the water troughs filled. He didn't announce any of it. He simply did it, the way a person does things that have become second nature over many years. That bothered her more than she expected. Not because she was ungrateful. She was grateful, more than she wanted to admit. But there was a difference between a man who followed instructions well and a man who already knew what needed doing before you told him. Samuel was the second kind. And that raised a question she couldn't quite shake loose. Where had he learned all this? On the fourth morning, she watched him from the kitchen window as he worked the fence line along the east pasture. He moved efficiently, no wasted motion, fixing posts that had been leaning since spring. At one point, he stopped, crouched down, and examined the soil near a post base for a long moment. Then he stood, walked 20 feet further along the fence, and started digging a new hole entirely, abandoning the original post without hesitation. Evangeline frowned. That was her fence. She hadn't told him to move anything. She went out. "I didn't say to relocate that post," she said, keeping her voice even. Samuel didn't stop working. The ground's soft for 8 feet in either direction of where it was sitting. Drainage problem. "Post'll be down again before winter if it stays there." She looked at the soil. She looked at where he'd chosen to dig instead. Slightly elevated, firmer ground. She didn't say anything for a moment. "How do you know that?" she asked. He drove the new post into the hole before answering. "Seen it before." That was all he gave her. She went back inside and stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, her coffee going cold in her hand. By the second week, the ranch felt different. She couldn't have explained it to anyone in a way that made logical sense. But the place felt steadier, like a wheel that had been slightly off its axle, and someone had quietly reset it without making a fuss. The cattle were calmer. The barn was organized in a way she hadn't thought to organize it herself, but that now seemed obvious. Small things, accumulated things. And Samuel himself remained exactly as unreadable as the day she'd brought him home. He wasn't cold. He answered when spoken to. He ate supper without complaint and always left the table clean. But he offered nothing extra. No stories, no complaints, no questions about her life or her plans. Most hired hands couldn't stop talking after 3 days of isolation. Samuel seemed to find the quiet as natural as breathing. It was Ida Pearson who first put the thought into words. Ida ran the dry goods store in Duster's Creek and was one of the few women in town who had never once made Evangeline feel foolish for running the ranch alone. She came out to the Cobb property on a Thursday, as she sometimes did, with a bolt of cloth and a tin of tea, and the two women sat on the porch while Samuel worked the far pasture. Ida watched him for a while without speaking. "He doesn't move like a drifter," she finally said. "No," Evangeline agreed. Drifters are restless, always scanning, looking for the next place. Ida tilted her head slightly. "That man moves like he owns the ground under his feet. Even ground that isn't his." Evangeline didn't answer. She had thought the same thing, in different words, more than once. "You know anything about him?" Ida asked. "His first name, that's all." Ida was quiet for a moment. "You're not curious?" Quote. "I'm practical," Evangeline said. "He works hard. He's reliable. That's what I needed." Ida smiled at her tea. Of course. The way she said it made Evangeline feel, unreasonably, like she'd been caught in something. The question of Samuel's past might have stayed quietly buried if it hadn't been for the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to the Cobb Ranch in a careful, formal hand. Evangeline almost set it aside. She received occasional correspondence from cattle buyers and feed suppliers, nothing urgent, but the name in the upper left corner of the envelope stopped her. Harrington and Associates, Land and Property Law, San Antonio, Texas. She stood at the kitchen table and turned the envelope over once. Then she opened it. The letter was brief. It was addressed to her as the owner of the property, and it informed her that a party by the name of Whitmore had filed a claim on a portion of the Cobb Ranch's eastern boundary, 40 acres, including the water source that fed the main cattle pasture. The claim alleged an unpaid debt owed by her father's estate. A hearing had been scheduled for 8 weeks from the date of the letter. Evangeline sat down slowly. 40 acres. The water source. Without it, the cattle couldn't graze the eastern pasture. Without the eastern pasture, she'd lose a third of her usable land. Without that land, the numbers in the ledger went from bad to something far worse. She read the letter twice more. Then she folded it carefully and set it face down on the table. When she looked up, Samuel was standing in the doorway. He had come in for the midday water, as he did each day. He looked at her face, then at the letter on the table. He didn't ask, but he didn't move either. "Legal trouble," she said, because the silence had weight, and she was tired of carrying it alone. He stepped inside. "What kind?" Quote. She hesitated. Then she slid the letter across the table. He read it standing up. He read it the way she had, twice. Then he set it down and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not pity, something more careful than that. "Do you know the name Whitmore?" he asked. "My father mentioned it once. Years ago. I don't know the details." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You'll need someone who knows land law, and you'll need the original boundary survey your father filed." "I know that," she said, more sharply than she intended. He didn't flinch. "Do you have the survey?" Quote. She paused. "I'm not sure." Quote. "Then that's where we start." She looked at him. That word, "we," had come out of him so naturally, so without performance, that she wasn't sure he had even noticed saying it. But she had. They spent that evening going through her father's documents. Evangeline had 3 wooden boxes of papers stored under the bed in the back room, deeds, receipts, letters, and records she had never fully organized. Samuel sat across the table from her, and they worked through them methodically, reading by lamplight, sorting in silence. At one point she looked up and found him reading a deed with an expression of focused attention that reminded her, suddenly and without reason, of a judge she had once seen in a courtroom. Not a cowhand, not a drifter. She put the thought aside and kept working. They found the survey just before 10 o'clock. It was folded inside an old land deed, slightly water-stained at one corner but fully legible. The boundary lines were clear. The eastern water source was unambiguously on Cobb property, had been since the original filing, 22 years ago. Evangeline exhaled slowly. "It's there," she said. "It's there," Samuel confirmed. He set it flat on the table and smoothed the edges with one hand. "Keep that separate from everything else. Don't let it out of the house." She nodded. Then, before she could think better of it, she asked the question that had been sitting in her chest for 2 weeks. "Samuel, what did you do before the cage?" Quote, the lamplight moved between them. He looked at the survey document for a moment, then at her. His expression didn't close off the way she expected. It did something more complicated than that. Something that looked, briefly, like a man deciding how much of a long story he was willing to tell. "Something I walked away from," he said quietly. "Why?" Quote, he was silent long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Because I wanted to know if I was more than what people expected me to be," he said, "or less." It was the most honest thing he had said since the day she had bought him out of that cage, and somehow it raised more questions than it answered. She lay awake that night, listening to the dry Texas wind move across the roof. The letter from Harrington and Associates sat on the kitchen table. The survey was folded safely beside it, and Samuel was in the bunkhouse 12 feet from the barn, sleeping, or not sleeping, in the same quiet way he did everything. She thought about what Ida had said. He moves like he owns the ground under his feet. And she thought about that single word he had used without thinking. We. She told herself it meant nothing. He was a practical man solving a practical problem. That was all. But somewhere under the practicality, a feeling was growing that she didn't have a clean word for yet. Something that felt less like gratitude and more like the particular unease of realizing that a person has become important to you before you gave them permission to. She closed her eyes. 8 weeks until the hearing, 6 months until his debt was settled and he was free to go. 6 months, she thought. It wasn't very long. The weeks before the hearing changed things between them in ways that neither of them named. It started with the work. There was more of it now. Not just the daily running of the ranch, but the preparation for the legal battle ahead. Evangeline wrote letters to the county records office in San Antonio. Samuel repaired and documented every fence line on the eastern boundary, walking each one with methodical care, making hand-drawn notes on a piece of paper he folded into his shirt pocket each morning. She noticed he wrote well. Clean, precise letters, the kind of handwriting that didn't come from a one-room schoolhouse. She noticed a lot of things she didn't remark on. One evening she came into the barn to find him teaching himself the ranch's breeding records, a thick ledger her father had kept for 15 years. He had it open across his knee and was cross-referencing it against the cattle in the nearest stall, with the quiet focus of a man doing arithmetic he already understood. "You're reading the breeding records," she said. "Your bull is too old for 3 of these cows," he said without looking up. "If you want a strong calf season, you'll need a younger one before fall." She stood in the barn doorway for a moment. The evening light came in sideways, long and golden, and it fell across him in a way that made the barn feel smaller than usual. "How do you know cattle breeding?" she asked. He looked up then. He held her gaze for a moment. That steady, gray-eyed look that she had stopped finding unreadable and started finding, instead, very readable indeed, which was almost worse. "I grew up on a ranch," he said. Simply, finally. She waited. "A large one," he added, "larger than this." "Where?" Quote, "North of here." A pause. "It doesn't belong to me anymore." There was something in the way he said it. Not bitter, not dramatic, just factual in the way that only truly painful things become factual after enough time has passed, that made her understand, without needing more words, that this was the heart of whatever story he was carrying. She didn't push, not that night. 3 weeks before the hearing, a man rode onto the property. He came at midday, well-dressed for the territory. A pressed jacket, clean boots, a horse that cost more than most men in Duster's Creek made in a year. He introduced himself as Mr. Gerald Whitmore, and he smiled at Evangeline, with the particular smile of a man who believed, before the conversation had begun, that he had already won it. "Miss Cobb," he said pleasantly, "I hope we can settle this without the unpleasantness of a formal hearing. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the 40 acres in question." "It's not in question," Evangeline said. "It's mine." Whitmore's smile didn't waver. "The deed your father signed in 1871 suggests otherwise. I have documentation." "So do I?" He glanced past her then, at Samuel, who had come to stand at the corner of the barn, not threateningly, just present. Whitmore looked at him for a moment with an expression that flickered too quickly for Evangeline to fully read. "Think carefully, Miss Cobb," Whitmore said, returning his eyes to her. "A woman running this ranch alone, the hearing will not be comfortable for you." "Then I'll be uncomfortable," she said. "Good day, Mr. Whitmore." He rode out without another word. Evangeline stood in the yard until the sound of his horse faded. Then she let out a slow breath. Samuel came to stand beside her, not close enough to be presumptuous, just close enough to be there. "He'll come back," Samuel said. "I know. And he wasn't just here about the land." She turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" Quote. Samuel watched the empty road for a moment. "The way he looked at me," he said carefully, "he recognized something. I'm not sure what." A cold feeling moved through her that had nothing to do with the wind. "Samuel," she said quietly, "I need to know who you are." He was still for a long moment. The kind of still she recognized now, not evasion, but a man gathering himself for something that cost him. Then he said, "My full name is Samuel Harrington." The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Harrington. The same name on the letterhead of the law firm in San Antonio. She stared at him. "The land law firm," she said slowly. "My father's firm," he said. Or it was. "Before I left." He looked at her steadily, letting her process it. "I walked away from it 6 years ago." From the firm, from the family ranch, from everything that came with the name. "I didn't want any of it. The inheritance, the control, the way my father did business." He paused. "The way men like Whitmore do business." "Whitmore worked with your father?" Quote. "Whitmore learned everything he knows from my father," Samuel said, "including how to use legal language to take land from people who don't know how to fight back." The silence between them was full and heavy. "You knew," she said slowly. "When you read that letter, you knew exactly what was happening." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." Quote. "I didn't know how to tell you without telling you everything," he said. "And I wasn't sure you'd want my help once you knew where I came from." She looked at him for a long time. There was no anger in her. She searched for it and found something more complicated instead. Something that understood, even if it wasn't ready to say so, that a person's origins and a person's choices were not always the same thing. "Can you fight this?" she asked. "Legally, do you know enough?" Quote. "I know everything," he said quietly. "I spent 4 years learning land law before I decided I wanted nothing to do with how it was being used." A pause. "I'd like to use it differently, if you'll let me." She looked at the road where Whitmore had gone, then back at Samuel. "Don't hide anything else from me," she said. "No," he said. "I won't." The hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in the Duster's Creek courthouse, a single room that smelled of pine wood and old paper. Evangeline sat at one table with the original survey folded in her hands. Samuel sat beside her. Whitmore arrived with 2 lawyers, and a stack of documents that he arranged on the table with confident precision. What happened over the next 2 hours was, to most people watching from the gallery benches, difficult to follow. Land law was not a subject that made for easy listening, but the result was not difficult to understand. Samuel spoke with a calm authority that filled the room without effort. He presented the original survey. He cited 3 separate legal precedents that directly contradicted Whitmore's claim. He identified 2 inconsistencies in Whitmore's documentation, 1, a filing error, 1, a date discrepancy, and presented both to the judge with the quiet precision of a man who had been trained for exactly this and had never forgotten a single lesson. Whitmore's lawyers exchanged looks halfway through. The confident arrangement of documents on their table began to feel less like preparation and more like decoration. The judge ruled in Evangeline's favor before noon. They rode home in the same silence they had ridden in the very first day, but it was a different silence now, fuller, easier, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Halfway home, Samuel spoke. "I want to tell you the rest of it," he said, "all of it, if you want to hear it." Quote, "I do," she said. And he told her. About his father's ranch in North Texas, vast, profitable, and run with a coldness that Samuel had spent his boyhood trying to understand and his young adulthood trying to escape. About the legal firm and the years of training, and the moment he had realized, with complete clarity, that he could not spend his life doing what his father did. About walking away. About the years of drifting, not aimlessly, but deliberately, learning what land and cattle and honest work felt like when they weren't instruments of leverage. About Morrow County and a dispute over a fence line he hadn't started but couldn't walk away from, and the cage. Evangeline listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, the ranch house was already visible ahead. "You could have told Hatch who you were," she said. "You could have had a lawyer there in a day." "I know." "Why didn't you?" Quote. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'd spent 6 years trying to find out if I was capable of being something on my own terms. Without the name. Without the money." He looked at her. "I wasn't ready to go back to it just to get out of a cage." She thought about that for a long time. "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said carefully, "I think I know the answer." The months that followed were the quietest and fullest of Evangeline's life. Samuel stayed past the 6 months. He didn't announce that he was staying. He simply didn't leave, and she didn't ask him to. And somewhere in the unspoken agreement between those 2 facts, something permanent began to take shape. He was honest with her about everything after that. His father, the firm, the inheritance he had not touched in 6 years and did not intend to touch now. She was honest with him about the ranch, the numbers, the fears, the nights she had lain awake wondering if she was enough to hold it together alone. They were, both of them, people who had learned to carry things quietly. Learning to set those things down in the presence of another person was slower work than either of them had expected. But it was good work. He asked her to marry him on an ordinary evening in October, sitting on the porch with the last of the summer's warmth still in the air, no ceremony to it. Just his voice, and her name, and a question that felt less like a beginning and more like the formal acknowledgement of something that had already been true for a long time. She said yes the same way, quietly, without performance. They were married 3 weeks later in Duster's Creek, with Ida Pearson as witness and the October sky wide and pale above the courthouse steps. Evangeline kept her father's name alongside his. The deed to the ranch was rewritten to read, Cobb Hawthorne Property. Samuel looked at those 2 names side by side on the document for a long moment. "Good," he said simply. She thought so too. The following spring, the ranch produced its strongest calf season in 15 years. The eastern pasture, all 40 acres of it water source intact, was green and full. The new bulls Samuel had sourced in November moved through the herd with quiet authority. Evangeline stood at the fence one morning watching it all, her coffee warm in both hands, and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has built something real. She heard Samuel's boots on the dry ground behind her, He came to stand beside her at the fence. Close, the way he stood now, without the careful distance of those first weeks. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That my father would have liked you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" Quote, "Because you don't talk more than necessary," she said. "And you know good land when you're standing on it." Quote. He looked out across the pasture. Then, with the particular ease of a man who had finally, after a long time, stopped being afraid of his own contentment, he smiled. It was, she thought, a very good smile, worth the wait. 2 years after the morning she had ridden into Duster's Creek, looking for a hired hand, Evangeline Hawthorne sat on the porch of the Cobb Hawthorne Ranch with a sleeping infant across her lap, a boy solid and quiet, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn set to the jaw. Samuel came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her without a word. The Texas morning stretched out ahead of them, wide and unhurried, belonging to no one and both of them at once. She leaned her shoulder against his. He stayed exactly where he was. The end. To everyone watching, if this story found you, I'd love to know, what corner of this world are you watching from? Drop your city, your country, or even just your continent in the comments. It genuinely moves me to think of these stories reaching places I may never see myself. And if you have thoughts, something you'd like more of, something you'd change, a direction you'd love a future story to go, please share it. Every comment shapes what comes next. If slow burn Western stories are your kind of thing, there are more waiting for you right here on this channel.